order would you like to go
I'm going
in?
to start with Elizabeth, Michael, Luke, Chuck, Ross.
That sounds perfect to me.
Only because that was the list as I went through on that page Elizabeth sent out.
Wonderful.
And just, are we going to be, oh, right, so yeah, everyone's coming in. Do you know how many, Elizabeth, do you know how many people?
We are getting ready to start. Well, hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Anglican Social Ethics and the Search for Justice. This is part of a webinar series brought to you by the SEEP Network, the Anglican Theological Review, and the Neshoda House Theological Seminary. My name is Chuck Robertson. I serve as canon to the presiding bishop for ministry beyond the Episcopal Church and as a distinguished visiting professor at the General Theological Seminary. And I am joining you today, as I know we are coming from all over the country and perhaps other parts of the globe. I'm coming today to you from Central Florida, from the Canterbury Retreat and Conference Center. Now, it is a privilege to moderate a panel discussion with such impressive colleagues, such impressive scholars of the church, PhDs all. First, I want to introduce to you Elizabeth Rain Kincaid, who is Assistant Professor of Ethics and Moral Theology at Neshoda House Theological Seminary. Welcome, Elizabeth. The Reverend Michael Battle is Professor of Church and Society and the Director of the Desmond Tutu Center at the General Theological Seminary. Michael, good to have you with us. Luke Bretherton is the Robert E. Cushman Professor of Moral and Political Theology and Senior Fellow at Duke Divinity School. Luke, we're delighted you're here. Chuck Matthews is the Carolyn M. Barber Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. It's good to have another Chuck here on this today. And the Reverend Ross Kane is Assistant Professor of Theology, Ethics, and Culture at Virginia Theological Seminary. Welcome indeed, Ross. Now, before we begin our discussion today, I want to thank Joe Swimmer, Executive Director of the SEEP Network, and his colleague, Kimberly Grass, for their production of this webinar and their practical assistance behind the scenes. Only our panelists will be visible to you all, but you who are attending can post questions in the chat room using your Zoom chat function. We'll try to address as many of those questions as possible as we go through this time, ending at 4:30 Eastern Time. A reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted tomorrow on the resource page at www.seepnetwork.org. Now, without further ado, I look forward to hearing some introductory remarks from our panelists, and we'll begin in the order I introduced them. So Elizabeth, if you would start us off.
Good afternoon, everyone. Chuck, thanks so much for moderating, and Joe, thanks for bringing us all together. In my brief remarks today, I want to describe how I think Anglican social ethics can provide an analytical approach based on an incarnational ecclesiology to both critique injustice and provide a solid grounding to begin constructive development of a solution. Anglican social ethics starts, in my opinion, with the analysis of the local, the particular, the granular, our awareness of what we owe the people next door, or perhaps next to us in the pews. Specifically, Anglican social ethics both begins and ends in the parish, the church and the parish boundaries which surrounds that church. It begins in the sanctuary, but then necessarily radiates outward through the church doors into the neighborhood beyond. There are several possible explanations for why this particular parish-based approach is particularly appropriate for Anglicanism. Just to list a few. One example is ecclesiological. Anglicanism, unlike Roman Catholicism, doesn't have a universal primate or an infallible magisterium, but rather consists of local communities bound together by instruments of union. A second is historical. For both practical and political reasons, the parish served as the key structural building block of the institutionalized church in the United Kingdom. A spiritual explanation is that Anglicanism at its core is centered in the prayer book, and something of the Benedictine charism of stability, groundedness, and the necessary combination of both prayer and work, ora et labora, in a chosen ground should inform our approach to social ethics and questions of justice today, beginning in the parish. And of course, a final theological component. Anglican theological reflection showed a consistent preoccupation with the mystery of the incarnation, and this theological reflection has been translated into a focus on the incarnational nature and ministry of the parish. To say that Anglican social ethics is Christological, grounded in the parish, and beginning from the analysis of particularity is nothing new. To provide a few relatively contemporary examples, Luke, or another panelist in his book, Christ and the Common Life, describes the goal of Anglican political theology as, quote, interpreting history from a Christological center outward, and at the same time exegeting it from the bottom up, giving priority to the testimony of those on the underside of history. Sam Wells in God's Companion has described the significance of the gathered Eucharistic assembly for defining the church. The church's gathering in one place to receive the body of Christ together constitutes, along with baptism, its most definite moment of identity. Sarah Coakley has described how understanding the continuity of communal worship within the parish creates a thin and holy space in the community and is integral to the rest of the church's ministry of care and prayer for the poor. In the rest of this paper, I'm going to identify some analytical approaches, which I think this mode of parish-based social ethics requires of parishes seeking to confront injustice. In other words, what does incarnational ministry in the Anglican social ethics tradition actually require from a parish? To provide examples of how this type of analysis plays out, I'm going to draw on an article written by Thomas Mosley, published in the British Critic, the Journal of the Oxford Movement in 1842. Nothing that I imagine most people have read, but I think it's a really great article because in the article entitled Pews, Mosley seeks to translate the Oxford Movement's theological focus on the incarnation into specific parish practices in line with the movement's intense focus on revitalizing parish ministries. In looking at the questions this essay asks about this particular practice around pews, we can clearly identify the analytical approaches which I believe characterize Anglican social ethics. So Anglican social ethics begins with analysis from a human perspective, considering the nature of the church as a human institution with historical roots and sociological significance, which exist in the world alongside all the other institutions that support and facilitate human existence. Thus, Mosley begins his attack on pews, and he doesn't mean all pews. He means the practices of renting pews that used to characterize churches in the Church of England by asking why. Why did churches permit this practice to develop? What good ends or societal pressures contributed to this practice? He argues that perhaps enclosed pews began as a means of shielding those who did not want to practice manual acts of worship, which they found abhorrent, i.e., Puritans. In addition, he traces how the practice of selling pew rentals became a means of raising clergy salaries, separating the priests both financially and physically from the congregation. Thus, the roots of the pew rental practice are in the division stemming from schism and in the lure of economic advancement. It's only by understanding the historical impetus behind a practice or a custom through this type of historical archaeology that its roots can be exposed. This process of historical excavation is challenging and time-consuming, not as emotionally satisfying as instant denunciation or as comforting as complacent acceptance of an established parish practice, but a necessary first step, since without understanding the historical wound, the cure cannot properly be applied. Thus, in the case of pews, the continuing pain of intra-ecclesial division and the significance of clergy vocation and pay must be addressed. So while the quest for historical understanding requires digging into the soil of the past, the search for justice requires scanning the horizon of the present through thoughtful sociological analysis. In the Pews essays, Mosley demonstrates that structures of injustice can be understood first through an analysis of physical structures, the pews. His interrogation of the practices of selling pews points to an obvious preference for the comfort of the rich and prestigious woven into the parish structure to the detriment of the care of the poor. Looking searchingly into this preferential option for the rich, he discovers a sociological presumption that the poor will inevitably follow the spiritual lead of the rich, so that the preferential treatment of the rich takes preeminence to the benefit of the poor and society. Mosley argues this approach ignores the sociological reality that it is in fact the poor who rebuke the rich by their true piety, rather than societally driven religious observances of the rich inspiring any type of true religion in the poor. Third, analytical approaches in Anglican social ethics is institutional analysis. The parish church as an institution exists among other institutions beyond its walls and outside its neighborhoods. So looking at the pews reflects a broader sickness in Victorian society's rigid class distinctions, disdain for the poor, manifested especially in a flawed political system where corrupt institutionalized practices deny the poor's votes and representation. The church is therefore corrupted by the failures in the government and economic institutions. However, those institutions are corrupted by the church's failures, where the church fails to care for the poor in preference to tending to the comfort of the rich. The failure of other institutions is sure to follow. This type of institutional analysis can be enriched by the use of an analogical imagination. For example, Mosley argues, and this is fascinating, 1842, the horror which the enslavement and segregations of blacks and whites in Episcopal churches in the United States should evoke in the British visitor should create a similar horror when the traveler returns home and encounters the segregation of rich and poor in the church in England. So we have three natural tools of discernment: historical, sociological, and institutional, which are important for Anglican social ethics. But that's not all the church is. It's not just an earthly institution. It's also the body of Christ. And understanding the church as the body of Christ leads Anglican social ethics beyond simply critique and easy answers to the search for constructive and redemptive solutions to injustice in the world. Acknowledging the church's nature as the body of Christ requires asking whom the church belongs to and whom is it for. If the church belongs to God, the argument that the payments of the rich to secure their private pews are necessary for the church's survival falls away. If God fights for us, why do we need to depend on riches alone? Therefore, the removal of pews should not be viewed as the end of the question, but only the beginning of a question, considering the power which the wealthy exert within the church and ensuring that this power is always ordered to God's ends. And if the church as Christ's body belongs to Christ, what does this mean for the church's actions and presence in the world? It means primarily the church is the place where God's people encounter him through the proclamation of the word of God and the administration of the sacraments. Therefore, simply removing the pews which visibly block the sacraments and separate those worshiping God is not enough. Rather, the removal of the pews points to a more fundamental correction of the injustice which impedes the worship of God, both proclamation of word and celebration of sacrament. The analysis through particularity enhances the universal standard of God's judgment of injustice, rather than reducing it. The word of God itself proclaims God is not truly worshiped and the sacraments are not appropriately administered where the needs of the poor are ignored. The very nature of Christian sacraments are that they are assigned to the rest of the world of God's presence and redemptive change of the world. Therefore, it's not enough to overcome injustice that private charity occurs within the church, and the visible equality of the rich and poor, Mosley argues, is demonstrated through the removal of the pews. Rather, the church, after removing physical structures, should be a force to transform societal structures, becoming, in fact, the poor man's court of justice. So where our historical, sociological, and institutional analysis leads to the solution that the pews were unjust and should be removed, understanding the church as God's body makes us think about the power of God's transformative grace and leads to a deeper analysis and a more comprehensive solution. Now, it's easy to do this when you're looking back at 1842. None of our churches, except maybe Ross's in Alexandria, still have built-in pews. But I think these 5 approaches are just as true and just as important for the church's social ethics today. We'll leave how for perhaps discussion. I'm sure will be richly supplemented by my fellow panel members.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm going to ask you and all the panelists, if you are mentioning specific important texts or certain important authors that would be helpful, because in listening, it might be helpful to put in the chat room for others or for us to make available to our attendees in some way. It'd be wonderful to have a way for them to know who you were quoting or what important piece you were looking at in case they wanted to follow that. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for doing some excavation there of the soil of the past in order to scan this horizon of today's present. Well, Michael Battle, I would love to hear from you next, please.
Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Joe, and all those who helped to bring us all together. I want to start with 6 assumptions and then give my 5 assumptions and then give 3 challenges that I think that are derived from all of these assumptions. So the assumptions that I want to first start with are, what is the Anglican Communion? And I want to use the Anglican Communion as our sort of definition of Anglican social ethics. The Anglican part of social ethics I want to understand through the lens of the Anglican Communion. So what are the common Anglican Communion assumptions? I think first, most of us assume the Anglican Communion is a unified church. I think secondly, if we had an hypnotist that would put us under and get us to give our implicit associations of who is Anglican, I think if you scratch the surface, that person would look white, the culture would be sort of Anglo-Saxon, the authoritative voices will be European. So I say first, the common implication or assumption is a unified church for the Anglican Communion. Second, I would say that most people would understand it as white. And then third, I think the common Anglican Communion assumption is that it is an established church. In other words, it's a church that goes along with civil society, that goes along with governments. It's an established church. So the first 3 of the 6 are common Anglican Communion assumptions. The last 3 assumptions that I want to talk about before I get into my own assumptions are common assumptions of justice. So again, I'm trying to operate from a subconscious lens of what most people are assuming of these terms and the topic that we're discussing today. So from my vantage point, I think most people assume justice, especially in the global north, is this way of understanding the European Enlightenment focused on individuals, such as an individual's rights, or human rights, or equality for individuals. So the first assumption that I think most people think of as justice is this assumption that comes from a European cultural worldview of the Enlightenment focused on the individual, equality for the individual. The second assumption that I think of as justice is equality from the perspective of inclusion. So I think as long as this is an inclusive society, I think most people think of that as justice. I'll get into this a little later in terms of my own assumptions, but I want to go ahead and start commenting. This second assumption of inclusion leaves out the one who is the one initiating or inviting who to be included. So the second is the equality of the perspective of inclusion, but it is even more subconscious of who the protagonist is, that is including the other. And so the third assumption of justice is a social contract, that is acting with justice in whatever social role one chooses. There is an assumed contract that we have with each other as a member of government, as a person in business, even in our own homes. There's a social contract that most of us assume that we need to abide by in order to be just persons. So those are my 6 assumptions that I want to start out with that I think are prevalent in our world. And again, I'll go through them again, trying to be a good teacher, to repeat what I've said. The common Anglican communion assumptions: unified church, white, and an established church. And I think the common assumptions of justice are, first, this European Enlightenment worldview of individual rights. Second, inclusivity. And third, a social contract. So I want to talk just briefly about my 5 assumptions and then give you the 3 challenges that I see. My 5 assumptions differ in this conversation that I've just mentioned to you or initiated with you in terms of those 6 assumptions. My first assumption is that the Anglican Communion is not a church. That is, it's neither a church in brick or mortar, as many people understand the church to be, the church down at the end of the block. And the Anglican Communion is not a traditional denominational order. For example, the Anglican Communion cannot join the World Council of Churches. Only a particular Anglican church can do that. The Episcopal Church, Church of Uganda, and so on. And those high in the hierarchy of Anglicanism now say we are a fellowship of distinct Christian communities. Authority resides in the local context, and yet we have the contradiction of the Episcopal Church thrown into the penalty box, no longer able to represent whatever it means to be Anglican in doctrine and ecumenism. So my first assumption is that the Anglican Communion is not a church, but there's a contradiction, because we act as an Anglican Communion to be a church when we want to be a church, and yet it seems as though the official word is that we are a fellowship of churches or Christian communities. My second assumption is that the demographical authority has shifted from a male country parson in England to a 34-year-old Nigerian woman. And this assumption of being the Anglican Communion in this sort of demographical worldview is important for the challenges that I will later bring up. The third assumption that I have is in terms of the previous distinction of establishment. Now the Anglican Communion looks more sect-like, as competing Anglican leaders seek to purify what is truly Anglican. So my third assumption is that we're no longer any kind of establishment, and that we look more like a sect than an establishment. Fourth, an Anglican social ethic is in crisis, as those who call themselves Anglican excommunicate each other, much less assume any social contract. In addition, at least in the global north, those who call themselves Anglicans are a dwindling population. So fourth, I want to say the Anglican social ethic is in crisis, largely because of a hypocritical way of behaving. And then fifth, I want to say I assume justice as a virtue. In virtue ethics, it is the concept of divine character capable of renouncing oppression and exploitation of all kinds. In other words, I understand justice as a virtue based on our character. One doing the inclusion is not European, but a character, a Nazarene born in poverty in the 1st century, revealed to be God with us. So I want to try to say that justice is more ontological. It's more about being. It's more about who you are, ultimately who God is. So just to go again quickly, just to rehearse what I said in terms of my own assumptions, the Anglican Communion is not a church. We've changed in our demographics. Number 2, in terms of the Anglican identity really looks like a 34-year-old Nigerian woman. And the church is no longer an establishment, number 3. And our Anglican social ethic is in crisis because of our behavior, which looks hypocritical to the world. And I want to say justice is more about character and being. And so I want to leave us with 3 different challenges. And I see these 3 challenges in the face of our 21st century apocalypse of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. So my first challenge is this. We can no longer be Anglican simply by a bishop having tea with the Queen every 10 years. That practice of knowing who is included in the Anglican Communion can no longer be a best practice. Number 2, the challenge that I want to leave us with, there needs to be a come to Jesus reckoning of how Anglicanism and colonialism are synonymous. And number 3, how can we take seriously again that justice is known in the revelation of Jesus Christ? How can we take seriously again that justice is a person? So my 3 challenges: how can we can no longer be Anglican simply by being invited to tea. Second, we need a reckoning between our own understandings of making Anglicanism and colonialism synonymous. And number 3, lastly, we need to take seriously the identity of Jesus being justice. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those points as well. Much appreciated. I could not help but think as you were speaking, and just want to briefly share as I look at our communion. In fact, people really do lose sight of the fact that our communion now is something that is global and not a single church. That all these sections that are not in the blue are part of our church, and of course ours and the Church of England might be some of the smallest in number among them. When you mentioned the 34-year-old Nigerian woman, it's a powerful way of showing the change that we've seen from past to present. Thank you, Michael, very much for that. Turning now to Luke, love to hear from you. Please unmute, Luke.
There we go. So huge delight and honor to be with you. I'm going to build on some of the comments that Elizabeth and Michael made, and I'm going to sketch 3 points, each taking its inspiration from a different set of Anglican divines and their social vision. And this is, I'm going to speak to our kind of current moment and try and kind of relate Anglican social ethics to this moment. And the first takes its inspiration from the Black Episcopal priest Peter Williams Jr.'s abolitionism, Vida Scudder's sacramental socialism, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu's Ubuntu social ethics, which Michael Battle has written a wonderful book on. And if these figures are my inspiration, my starting point are 2 verses from Scripture. And the first is Luke 22, 25, 26. He said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors, but not so with you." And then John 13:14-17, so if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you in an example, that you should do as I have done to you. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. So if in the Lucan passage, those with authority desire not only to rule, but to be admired and judged as benefactors. This contrasts with the Johannine passage, in which rule is identified with being blessed by God and being a blessing to each other through mutual service and fellowship. I think these two passages can help orientate our response to the interlinked crises of COVID, racial reckoning, and ecological collapse. Williams, Scudder's, and Tutu's social ethics are all premised on a relational anthropology. When there is no me without you, no you without me, I can only come to be through another person and the web of relations within which I'm always already entangled. To be blessed and to be a blessing is to respond to this web of relations through mutual sharing and care symbolized in the washing of feet. Work to restore or enable such covenantal and cooperative relations of mutual fellowship brings blessing, but it involves recognizing our vulnerability, taking risks, and sharing what we have in mutual service. Such a social vision stands in stark contrast to the structure of ancient patron-client relations that the Lucan passage refers to, in which there's still care, but that can be very generous, but it's not mutual. There's no risk. It revolves around philanthropic donation and doing things for others rather than with others. This kind of noblesse oblige marks us as independent, invulnerable, separate from those in need. To be a benefactor is at the same time to legitimize one's status and to mark one's superiority of status. This distinction between benefaction and blessing, I think, helps frame responses to the contemporary moment and its history. It's worth remembering that colonialism was justified through an ideology of benefaction, Rudyard Kipling's 1899 poem, The White Man's Burden, being but one articulation of this view. Colonialism and the racial and extractive capitalism it embodied was justified as a project of care, of civilizing less fortunate others. In this moment, we're trying to dismantle the legacies of that system of benefaction. But in doing so, it's vital we do not repeat then another modern system of benefaction. From the Great Depression and post-World War II era onwards, there was a turn to technocratic systems of rule by experts and elites that claimed to know better how everyone else should live. The poor were to move from being underdeveloped to developed through market-based, technocratic, and instrumentalizing mostly state-driven structures of care. Questions of meaning and purpose were ignored or denigrated. Questions about the quality and character of relations between people were treated as externalities. What mattered was being part of an advanced economy, never mind that it destroyed local communities and their ecologies. Now, I realize many of us want more experts in the face of conspiracies, theories like QAnon, and the politicization of basic public health requirements like wearing a mask. But that is why technocracy as a form of benefaction is a temptation for educated elites. We benefit others, but in doing so, we ignore questions about the distribution of agency and power. Is the answer to do things for those in need through the most efficient and effective means our data points decide, or the slow, boring work of building a more shalom-like common life with those in need, ones in which questions about the distribution of power, questions about meaning and purpose of education, of health, of politics itself is in view, and the quality and character of relations between us is front and center, as Michael pointed to, questions about virtue. Will responses to COVID and to racial and extractive capitalism be shaped by benefaction or blessing? And this brings me to my second point, the need for a genuinely democratic response to the crises we face. Here, my points of reference are John Neville Figgis's critique of the state, Rowan Williams's notion of interactive pluralism and contemplative pragmatism, and my own aligned conception of a radical consociational democracy. The need to cultivate a just and generous common life of interdependent care and mutual blessing is central to any meaningful social ethics. We do so by addressing specific issues, decent housing, living wages, health and safety measures. But the issues are the beginning point, not the main point. The main point is the quality and character of relations between people. A thriving neighborhood or city or state is dependent on an ecology of trust and mutual aid, as well as strong institutions serving the interests of their members to sustain this trust and mutual care over time. None of this happens spontaneously. It needs organizing. And through organizing together, we move from being a mere population who can be manipulated and exploited to becoming a people. Democratic politics provides the context for this kind of organizing work. Through it, people can develop the agency to have some say over the conditions and character of their common life. Through democratic politics, we can act and not simply be acted upon by state and market mechanisms. Democracy at heart is about forming a common life through ensuring that political and economic agency is distributed as widely as possible. Democratic politics can be distinguished from democracy as a mode of statecraft, i.e. democracy reduced to voting systems, separation of powers, rule of law, etc. Democratic politics names a set of practices for generating non-violent forms of relational power and cooperation through various kinds of shared speech and action, community organizing, trade unions, cooperatives, and the like. I want now to contrast this vision of democratic politics as the cultivation of a just and generous common life between us with the political vision that dominated Anglican political theology since the 17th century, in which Michael's just pointed to and named as establishment. Thomas Hobbes gave an early and now classic account of this vision as about statecraft. Statecraft is what most of us think of when we use the word politics. It signifies bureaucracies, elections, parties, laws, and the like, all of which constitute a sovereign state. For Hobbes, the sovereign state, or what he called Leviathan, was there to protect and sustain life. Outside of its protection and provision, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Without the sovereign state, we could not survive, let alone thrive. Now, the price of its protection and provision that was we give up a measure of our freedom. The state gets to tell us what to do and how to do it, having ultimate authority over our lives. And in return, we can turn to the state to defend us, organize us, and provide us what we need at a point of crisis. This is played out in the pandemic when we're literally confined to our homes. We've given up our freedom while we look to the state to protect us from what will kill us and act to save us economically. Now, how well it does this is another matter. But contrary to what Hobbes argued, politics is not just about statecraft. As I've tried to set out here, politics is also a way of sustaining a common life and the ecologies of trust and mutual aid this is based on. Again, coping with disasters, whether pandemics or hurricanes, brings this home with stark clarity. The state can be a crucial means of providing the basic conditions of life in the form of FEMA, but so is the social infrastructure of mutual aid between neighbors and friends, and the self-organized institutions like congregations. This often invisible social infrastructure can make the difference between life and death. As many have experienced during this pandemic, this social infrastructure is vital for providing food and physical support long before state services arrive or become operational. This meshwork of self-organized relationships, social practices, and institutions, and the ecology of trust they foster enables us to respond to shocks and disasters. Now, Democrats and Republicans focus on state and market-centric solutions to shared problems or disasters. None really attends to the need to strengthen this social infrastructure. They're not interested in developing policies and practices that distribute power so that more people have the agency by which to craft a thriving common life. So there's always a need to tend and defend our shared social life against being entirely subordinated to and desecrated by the market and the state. The fight is to stop our common life serving state and market and ensure state and market mechanisms serve and uphold the flourishing of society. It's exactly this struggle that lies before us in recovering from the pandemic. The irony is that neither the market nor the state can function well unless embedded in a rich ecology of social trust. If the banks lose trust, then we have a run on the banks and the financial system collapses. If we don't trust the opposition when we lose an election, then we take to the hills with our AR-15s or AK-47s and the government collapses into civil war. If we're going to have a just transition to recovery, we need a dance between statecraft that protects and provides and a democratic politics of a common life, building up the common life of trust and mutual care and strengthening local institutions is key to developing a just and resilient recovery. The state and market have a place, but they must know their place. State policies and economic provision are vital. Mutual aid is not an alternative to state provision, but sits alongside it. Anglicans, after all, are not anarchists. The state has a role. As per Hobbes, we need public authorities to coordinate and provide. For example, producing a vaccine will need state investment and coordination of research and delivery. But neither are we libertarians. Not everything can be left up to the market. Indeed, the market often fails to provide, especially for the most vulnerable, who depend on a combination of macro-scale state provision and micro-scale mutual aid. And economic policies and practices cannot be allowed to undermine a just recovery by concentrating power and money in the hands of large corporations, as happened in the wake of the Great Recession, where we saw the banks bailed out, but not the homeowners. So a democratic common life politics is vital for ensuring state and market do not take the opportunity of this emergency to exponentially increase their power. That will take broad-based coalitions and organizing work. But in that work, and amid its struggles and frustrations, we can take heart that such work is work that blesses. Now, to cultivate this reciprocal common life of mutual blessing, we need to attend to the relationship to the mundane, everyday realm of our lives. And this brings me to my last point, the need for a Georgic vision of the interplay between continuity and change. And my touchstones here are the poets George Herbert and R.S. Thomas, and the novelist Jane Austen, who I'm claiming is an Anglican social ethicist, but more specifically the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who's a hugely influential figure in the development of Anglican social ethics. Coleridge abhorred both Jacobin and anti-Jacobin tendencies alike, or in our terms, reactionaries and hyper-progressives. In contrast, he believed that a humane culture must have an interplay between what he called permanence, the tending of our inherited customs and traditions, and progression, innovation and development of new approaches. Coleridge was alive to how we're always already caught between continuity and change, so must learn to live and act as frail, time-bound creatures in need of shared forms of life that can adapt and innovate. I think the kind of pastoral or Georgic vision of the interplay of continuity and change over time and how customs and shared forms of life rooted in particular places, which Elizabeth was talking about, and that Coleridge and others articulate, contrasts with all forms of zealotry in politics, whether on the left or the right. It rejects all forms of political messianism. In this moment, when we're overcome by apocalyptic sensibilities, it's a spiritual discipline to cultivate the kind of Georgic or pastoral sensibility that Coleridge points to as a social ethical vision. A Georgic social ethics recognizes we always already find ourselves in the middle of the quotidian, everyday world of ordinary life that must be cultivated if children are to be raised, crops planted, and life is to go on. Georgic is the technical term for the pastoral literature and is derived from Virgil's poem, The Georgics, which depicts scenes of farming and cultivation. The Old Testament is, of course, awash with pastoral imagery and concerns, and likewise, Jesus' teaching and parables are suffused with agricultural and pastoral imagery, populated as it is by shepherds and sowers and vinekeepers. But alongside the world of work, through which we cultivate shared realms of meaning and action, the pastoral also refers to the everyday world of family life, another stream of scriptural reference. Sons run off and return, children are healed and nursed, food is prepared and eaten. The pastoral encompasses the mundane joys and everyday struggles that make up what the liturgy calls ordinary time. These too are crucibles of divine disclosure, and constitute part and parcel of political and social life. A Georgic vision, a Georgic register, no less than an apocalyptic one, is vital for faithful, hopeful, and loving social ethics. So these are my 3 points to help orientate our response to the contemporary moment. The need to cultivate relations of mutual blessing and fellowship rather than position ourselves as benefactors or look to orders of benefaction as the answer. The need for a common life, democratic, agency-centric politics of mutual aid rather than leaving it all up to the state and the market to solve our shared problems. And finally, the need for a Georgic vision of social change to sit alongside an apocalyptic sense of urgency. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Luke. I appreciate that and would echo what I actually said earlier after Elizabeth, if both you and Michael would also make sure and note any key names, any key figures, any key points, so that to do that for all attendees so that they can make sure and be able to look up for themselves as well. I move from one Chuck to another. Charles Matthews, looking forward to hear from you.
All right, thanks. Can you hear me now? I was on mute, so I'm trying to unmute. Great. Well, there's a lot to agree with what other people have said. I have basically 6 straightforward points, and I'll try to be quicker than 10 minutes so that I think we have a lot of people who want to ask questions. First, thanks to Elizabeth and Chuck, the other Chuck, and Joe and everybody for coming together on this day. It feels important and significant for all of us. I have a friend here in Charlottesville, another Anglican and Episcopalian. She's a minister in a church, and I asked her, she's seen some of these webinars, and I asked her, you know, what would be useful for you? And she said, well, there are really 2 things. One is that I'd really like to think about things that I could use for preaching and preaching from, and the other is just a sense of communion or community with people. Right now, a lot of us feel very alone, and I think that's especially true for theological leadership. It's always lonely. But in these days, especially, I think leaders in general are having it worse than the rest of us. And so insofar as I can do anything to help there, insofar as we all can do anything to help, I think that would be a great thing. What Luke said, what Michael said, what Elizabeth said about the chaos of our world right now seems to me very important. It's quite a time. It's not just the pandemic, it's not just in the US and then around the world, issues of struggling with white supremacy and anti-Blackness and racial justice. It's an ecological crisis. And in a way, like a family in crisis, it seems like all the crises have seemed to culminate at one moment, so that everything is kind of blowing up at once. And it feels a bit like that. It feels to me like a version of the sufficient unto the day is the trouble thereof. And in fact, sometimes I wonder if it's more than sufficient. But it seems that God disagrees with me. And in this, I speak also of a Polish poet who I love very much, Adam Zaghievsky. And I'll give you the name and I'll give you the book after I've done this. But just a quote from Zaghievsky in his wonderful book, A Defense of Ardor. He says in that book that we cannot escape being part of the world. And this is a direct quote from him. We are so prosaic, so ordinary. Do we even deserve poetry? But we too will be legends for future generations because we once lived and our words will mean more than we care to admit today. Whether we like it or not, whether we think we can endure it or not, here is where we are. And I think we must admit that Zaghievsky says something importantly true. Our words and our deeds will mean more than we can imagine. They will be permanent and historic. One day, we will be legends in one way or another. I have no doubt that in 50 years, there will be lots of movies, for instance, about this time in American history. And lots of people will try to think about what they would have been doing in this moment. We have the mixed blessing of not being able to see those movies. What we get to do, though, is in fear and trembling, work to determine how best we will appear in this moment. So what I take from my prayer life and what I take from Adam Zaghievsky is that in some sense, we have to have some faith and some hope that even though we feel overwhelmed, there is something positive about these opportunities for us today. The possibility of thinking about the usefulness of Anglican social ethics is, to me, one of the advantages of this moment. Because this tradition, as you've heard again and again here from Elizabeth, from Luke, from Michael, is a powerful moral and political vocabulary, which by and large we mostly don't know about. And it was a vital language for thinking about social life as something that can be changed in the 19th and 20th centuries. It was a very, very powerful language. But it seems to have somehow gone missing for us in our preaching and our conversation in churches, particularly in the US, it seems to me, where we have confused establishment with complacency. And we seem to have mistaken the relationship between theological integrity and theological stability. It seems to me that our confidence that our authorities in the world will tell the truth about the way society is, which is the mark of an establishmentarian church, of course, a kind of faith in the basic structure of the social order to basically tell the truth, has been going further and further away from the facts on the ground for a number of decades. And it seems to me that as churches, we should take back our obligation to try to think for ourselves about the way the world is. As I think you heard Luke say, I don't think this is a very partisan thing, although it is very partisan in this moment, perhaps, but it's not necessarily fundamentally a partisan thing. It's simply a matter of the churches trying to reclaim for themselves the ability to tell the truth about the world as they see it. I think we need to do that. Because of our establishmentarian bias, we have been uncomfortable about this, and for good reasons. But I think, as Michael said, insofar as this is an establishmentarian church, it's going to need to come to terms with the fact that its establishmentarianism has been part of the problem often, and not nearly as much of the solution as it needs to be. Now, the request for us in today's meeting is to talk about the parishes thinking about justice and how parishes can work for justice. I am in favor of immediate and direct work on justice work in parishes and for churches. And here in Charlottesville, we do some of that. But I'm also interested in thinking about what churches can do over the long term to help people understand and rehabilitate this language that they can use to think about their lives and the social order in general in a way that is, I think, pretty rare and unusual in our society these days. The fact that this is a long-term project should not lead us to discount its importance. It is, and it must be, I think, a central mode in which the Christian churches can influence public debate, not by the immediate introduction or imposition of theological categories or frameworks on that debate, not necessarily that, but by the slow and steady shaping of minds in the churches and through other institutions to understand what the church's vision of the world is. This is historically how Christianity has primarily influenced societies in general. It's working to change the terms in which we think about our world, because that's a deeper transformative power than simply pumping for one side or another in the options that are presented to us in the moment. Certainly, pumping for one side or the other is always a thing that churches should be doing. But we should not forget our central duty to provide an entirely different way of thinking about the world. And that, I think, is part of the blessing of the Anglican social ethical tradition. Augustine, one of my touchstones, once said in his work De Doctrina Christiana, which is a work about Christian teaching and preaching, he said that no matter what a minister says, however, a preacher's life is their truest speech. And I think that's true about Christians in general. And I don't think Augustine would disagree with me on that either. So even while we say that what we're talking about is a way of speaking and thinking about the world, if the way of speaking and thinking about the world does not manifest itself in the flesh, in our behavior, and in our relations, then it probably doesn't have the meaning that we think it does. Now there is, I think, a distinctive and even Anglican way of looking at the world, speaking historically, a way that is not entirely consonant with the dominant visions of the world that we've inhabited. And it throws a strange light on the received picture of how we think about things. This is funny for us as Anglicans, and we've heard some of this with both Elizabeth, Michael, and Luke. This is funny for us because we are, even as we are the curators of this powerful alternative vision, we also are, of course, inheritors of a powerful establishmentarian vision. The Anglican Church has to, as Michael I think rightly said, come to terms with its sense of itself as part of the authorities. We have far more likely been Pharaoh and Herod than we have been the marginalized and the oppressed, at least in the United States, maybe also in England. But think for a minute about justice, and think about what Michael said about thinking about justice as a virtue. Think about justice as embodied in Jesus, something Luke has pointed to as well. That seems to me a very powerful example of the kind of thing that the Anglican tradition can offer. In today's social order, when anyone publicly speaks about justice, if anyone talks about being a pro-justice politician or anything like that, you pretty much know what they mean. They mean someone who's going to be as punitive as possible in the criminal justice world. You don't have anyone in public life these days talking about being a pro-justice politician and then appealing to issues of social justice or the distribution of basic goods and things like that. We think about justice by and large in reciprocal and punitive ways, as something relating to the past. But that's not the whole of justice at all. And in fact, if you look at the example of Jesus and how Jesus deals with people, he often attends to the past, but he speaks to them of a possible future. And this is not just a matter simply of mercy of Jesus's part. This is not a cancellation of justice. This is the idea that somehow in their individuality, these people will be a future that we can all share and inhabit together. That possibility of justice is a kind of a justice that the social ethical tradition should be exploring, thinking about, affirming, and trying to inhabit. And that gets us to something I think quite theologically deep about this tradition, something that the contemporary American philosopher, Jonathan Lear, has talked about in terms of radical hope. There is something radical about the hopefulness of this vision of social ethics. Even as we graciously and sinfully try to embody this vision, we are also graciously and sinfully trying to reveal how the ordinary life of our world is something far more sacramentally significant than what we might initially think it is. This is, it seems to me, the core weirdness of this tradition. The idea being that in some sense, there is something radically transfiguratively strange about the gospel of God that is sent to us and that we are called to embody. And I think that core theological message, which is, I think, at the heart of the Anglican social ethical tradition, is something that actually underpins it all, that kind of sacramental transfiguration of the ordinary that we can see. And I think with that, I'll just end.
Thank you so much for that, Chuck. And again, please offer your thoughts. And all of these, by the way, just so you know that all of our panelists today will be sharing with our SEEP behind the scenes team the highlights of what they have so that they can, so that in turn you can be able to have a list, a register of all that you've been hearing in terms of names and key things, key references that they have listed. So we look forward to receiving that. Well, Ross, it looks like you're batting cleanup here. So bring us home to the point, and then we will engage with some of the questions that I've been looking at.
All right. Yeah, ready to bring us home here. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks to Elizabeth and Joe for all the organizing. I know these sorts of things take a lot of work to put together, and I'm really humbled to be on such a distinguished panel of folks here. If I had to give a title to my remarks today, I think I'd call it the Anglican Parish Model, Tool of Racism or Anti-Racism. And I want to start with a story. Recently, I read a seminary student's analysis of an Episcopal congregation that was struggling to gain new members in an intercultural neighborhood. Now, despite the fact that the population of the neighborhood was growing and the parish itself was committed to evangelism and growth, they couldn't quite bring in new members from the surrounding community. Now, during previous generations, when the neighborhood had grown, the parish had grown too. So what was different this time, we wondered? As students and faculty discussed this situation, we wondered if the parish would benefit from a lesson, a reminder about the Anglican parish system. The idea that in Anglicanism, and Elizabeth talked about this, that a congregation's sense of identity extends beyond its members to the entire population of the surrounding area. As good Anglicans, we all then nodded our head and agreed that the parish model would be one of the keys to giving this congregation new life. Looking back though, I wonder if we missed something in this conversation. The parish model isn't simply a solution for this predicament. In the United States, in a predominantly white denomination, the parish model can be part of the problem. When we look at Episcopal Church growth over the last century, our predominantly white denomination grew especially after World War II, when new congregations accompanied the path of white flight. Redlining meant that new Episcopal parishes were founded in white-only neighborhoods, such that one's parish, if you will, was exclusively white. Now, the parish model, at least in my own experience and in my own education as an Episcopal priest, is one of the primary means by which Anglicans talk about our tradition's distinctive approach to Anglican social ethics. But it's not a panacea, the parish model. It's a strategy, and it's one that can be used for good or for ill. The parish system can be a means of perpetuating racism, but it can also be used for anti-racism. The main idea I want to suggest today is this, that in the United States, the parish model can be a means of anti-racism for predominantly white Episcopal churches if they can approach their history and their current spirit and the current work in the spirit of confession and with the aim of making amends. So the parish model can be a means of anti-racism if it's done in the spirit of confession and with the aim of making amends for past wrongs. Now, first, it's worth saying just a bit by way of reminder about the Anglican parish model. Anglicans often contrast the parish model with the Congregationalist approach, wherein the church sees itself as a voluntary community whose primary sense of identity is its own members. The parish model, by contrast, and here there's a sense of responsibility for all who live within a region, within the borders of a parish. British theologian Ben Quash offers a succinct summary of the parish system. In his book, Found Theology, he says, "The Church of England, in its established form, is committed by its parish structure to minister to all those who live in England. Every area of land is covered by a parish, and every resident of that parish, whether he or she is Anglican or not, whether he or she is a Christian or not, is someone to whom the church has an obligation. They are souls for whom the parish understands itself to have curatorial responsibility." Now, even in Quash's tone here, we hear a certain wistful appreciation for this system, one reflected in my opening story. In the United States, of course, the Episcopal Church is not an established church, like Michael talked about, but we have inherited this tradition, and it remains an important tool for Anglican social justice in the United States. Now, if the primary virtue of the parish model is its deep connection to place and geography, then its limitations are similarly linked to place and geography. In the United States, after all, we cannot talk about race without talking about place. White Americans have consistently established and upheld laws that provide us access to more economically desirable places and prevented others, especially Black Americans, from accessing them. This gets us back to the congregation that opened my talk. They were themselves established during white flight. And this set up a heavily white identity that proved really hard to shake. And when the neighborhood began to change, they struggled to welcome their neighbors because their neighbors were no longer white. And there wasn't much conscious animus towards their neighbors. In fact, they spoke openly about how much they appreciated being in a more intercultural neighborhood. But their habits were so white that they struggled to welcome people of color despite their attempts to do so. Now, this pattern is far from unusual in the Episcopal Church. Look at the geography of churches newly established in the 1950s, the 1960s. And if you want a visual picture, think of all the A-frame Episcopal churches that popped up during that time. That's kind of the hip architecture. In many cities across the US, newly established churches provided a basic map of white flight. It's not just that churches followed white flight, it's that they were often the first institutions established along its path. White churches did not simply benefit from white flight, that is, they helped promote white flight. With persons of color redlined out of these suburbs, a priest inspired by the parish model could minister to a nearly exclusively white population. The parish model could promote racism. And other aspects of our denomination could then feed this too, such as vestries run in this very formal fashion with Robert's rules and a hymnal that draws primarily from European music and so on. And nor, I should say, is this challenge exclusive to suburban Episcopal congregations. And this is especially true today. There are plenty of urban congregations experiencing increasing membership right now, and this is driven partly by gentrification and growing white populations in cities. So here too, it's necessary to face the institutional and historical racism that's associated with such a change. So that's just a brief word on how the parish model can feed racism in the United States. But are there ways that the parish model can be used for anti-racism? My remarks here can only be preliminary, in part because I defer to the practitioners whose work is ongoing in this area. I think that we're still kind of building a corpus of work to reflect upon. But nevertheless, I believe that the parish model can be a means of anti-racism if, again, a parish approaches it in a spirit of confession and with the aim of making amends. And one could approach this in three parts. The first is learning history. The second is seeking intercultural relationships. And the third is working to repair harm. So learning history, seeking intercultural relationships, and working to repair harm. In learning history, a parish can identify ways in which it has participated in and or benefited from institutional racism within its specific location. And this kind of research is foundational for then making amends. A parish might examine, for example, which neighborhoods its parishioners left during white flight and start to form relationships with churches in that neighborhood. It can then learn how they might help repair the brokenness of this local institutionalized racism. Or for the congregation that I talked about earlier, that's in the intercultural neighborhood now, they could examine their history and then after that go through this process of a communal self-examination, if you will, wherein the congregation explores what parts of their institutional habits are so off-putting to newcomers who are not white. They can build relationships with people in their community who can tell them how and why their congregation seems so unwelcome. In short, I'm suggesting something that's a bit like asset mapping in a community, but let's call it racism mapping or sin mapping. Asset mapping, of course, is this practice of finding existing strengths and resources in a community for the sake of problem solving. It's rightly gaining traction in congregational studies. I think it's a great tool, but let's also remember to map the social sins that surround our parish communities. So learning history and seeking intercultural relationships then informs the work of repair, the work of making amends. The precise form of amends, of course, will look different in every parish, in every context. But what can be said more widely is that it's important for white parishes to let others take the lead in suggesting what amends for racism might look like. White parishes should listen first and keep listening. White folks are saying a lot now, we need to listen first, but actually, we white folks sometimes just jump right in after we listen. We need to listen and keep listening. And once we've done that hard work of identifying how our community has participated in racism, responses can be specific and broad. For the parish in an intercultural neighborhood, some small specific responses could include mixing up decisions about who makes hymn choices, or changing the way that a parish runs its meetings to be more welcoming. But more broadly, and I think this is more significant, parishes can examine changing the internal power structures in our congregations that often favor white populations. We can give financial and volunteers support to efforts in healing and racial healing. And more importantly, parishes can make reparations to communities that one's congregational life has harmed. what would reparations entail for a white Episcopal parish? I think that's a question that we really should be asking ourselves. These are only a few examples that begin the conversation, and this should all be done in the spirit of ongoing confession, not a sense that once some initial work is done, the task is over, because this is a broader spiritual transformation that we're undertaking. And finally, white churches have to avoid doing this work with a sense of white munificence, which is admittedly this frequent temptation in the Episcopal Church. That's that benefactor model that Luke talked about. So to conclude, the parish model can be a means of perpetuating racism, but it can also be a means of anti-racism if parishes can learn their history, seek intercultural relationships, and make amends. Parishes, however small, can thereby be a means of repairing our wider social sins in America. Parishes can be leaven in the loaf for healing these wounds. So that's my little bit there.
Thank you so much for that, Ross. Great way to bring us through to the end of the first these opening remarks before we open up to some of the questions we've been getting. I was especially noting about what you said about race, and you can't talk about race without talking about space as well. You talked about white fly. I also can't help but think about Native Americans. And historically, we have two great original sins, don't we? Certainly with African Americans, and also what we have done with space for Native Americans. Much that we could be thinking about that in various parts of the United States as Christians.
Absolutely.
As we look at all the questions that have been, I wish we had time to hit all of them. And I'm going to simply also invite our panelists to take note of them for themselves. We'll make sure that they get copies of this, of the chat room, so they can take note of that. And it may be that some of them want to address those one-on-one with some of you. But I did see a couple questions I think are crucial for us to hit in the short time we have left. One of which was, it came out of the comment that was made about a slow and steady shaping of minds. But I think this is an excellent question for all of you. Are we always condemned as the church to always somehow be behind the eight ball? Always speaking prophetically and acting boldly after the fact? What would you all say to that? And thank you, Ken, for that. This is not a rhetorical question.
I'll jump in. I mean, I think it goes, and it slightly relates to another question there about kind of apocalyptic. I think it's I don't think that's true, and I don't think it has been true. And I think there are plenty of historical examples, right? Whether we go back to the creation of hospitals, through to the creation of national schooling systems, through to the creation of the welfare state, which William Temple was right on the cutting edge of generating. Modern institutions, and I would say ancient institutions that are there to address the wounds of the world, have always, the church has been at this, has been at the site of those wounds, generating both theological vision and institutional response, often way ahead of others. The abolition movement, the church was caught up in white supremacy. The birth of the notion of a social movement, of which there's, you know, lots of kind of fantastic histories of social movements, date it from first Methodism as a social movement, and then abolitionism as the first kind of social justice movement. Both one literally a church born out of Anglicanism, the other a church-led social movement. So I don't think that's true. I don't think we're always behind the curve. But I think there is a very thing, and this goes back to my point about the Georgic and the apocalyptic. I think there's a sense in which, in the moment, there's this strong apocalyptic sense, the kind of Rabbi Hillel's wonderful question, if not now, when? This sense that we've got to kind of act now. And I think there's a proper sense of the church as a community of memory rooted in places that the parish speaks to, that says there is wisdom from ancestors to be learned. There is customary practices which are there to be honored. If you abolish everything, Rome abolished is not Israel empowered. There's a sense in which you have to draw on traditions, draw on customary practices, draw on the cultivation of relations over time, questions about the cultivation of virtue, which Michael pointed to generate a genuine transformation. And this is Coleridge's point about permanence and innovation. It's always an interplay. And part of our, I think, contemporary moment is we're caught in the tyranny of the present and think that everything has to be happening now and only what is to come is what matters. And there's no sense of how do we cherish what has been. And so we're caught in this false dichotomy. One side of our political spectrum says, make America great again, i.e. you've got to go back is the only way to kind of go on. And another says you've got to be on the right side of history, i.e. you've got to abandon all that is past and all that is righteous lies ahead. And we've got to trash the past. And so I think the church as a community of memory grounded in practices of placemaking, spoken to by the parish, is there to kind of this cultivation of the interplay of continuity and change. And we see that in its response over 2,000 years to the wounds of the world.
Thank you for that, Luke. Yes, I am appreciative of you saying how often we have actually been ahead of the curve or right there at the moment. Certainly in our own lifetimes, we do think about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, an exemplar father figure and certainly model to many of us. At the same
I would just add also another, I mean, in that moment, 1989, let's go back to that democratic renewal moment. Mm-hmm. The whole of Eastern Europe and the end of communism, the church, particularly in East Germany, was the center of that movement, and in solidarity in Poland. So again, in living memory, we have these very, very important moments.
Absolutely, but also in living memory, we have Dr. King saying that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. So, which kind of takes us back to what Ross was saying. I think, we have a choice here, which of course is what you all have been kind of pressing us, is that there's a choice for us, not just individually, but more importantly as communities of faith. Would others like to dive into that? Or I also want to make sure that we also touch on some of the other questions. I saw one that spoke about, what does it mean when we think about Jesus quoting Hosea, I desire mercy, not sacrifice? What does that mean for, as we talk about justice today? This was to Dr. Battle, to Michael, but I think this is for any of us who would like to jump in. Michael, you have first dibs if you wish.
Sure. I think it's an astute question. I would just say that the reason that I focus on Jesus is not so much to figure out how to proselyte or to change someone who is Muslim into Christian. It's more that theologically, to understand Jesus as justice is to understand that we are created. God created us. God is the one who included us. And Jesus is sort of a quantum physics in terms of showing us how we can understand each other. And that's where true justice comes in. And so Jesus becomes that mirror, that way of understanding that if you treat someone like you treat yourself, if you are willing to die for others, if Jesus's lens, perspective, epistemology is what I'm trying to get at in terms of inclusion. God is the only one who truly should be the one including. Human beings should be the ones cooperating. And the minute that we try to justify including the marginalized, we have to be astute enough to see who is the human source of including. And therefore, I think one of the chat responses is right, that if we're not careful, we're talking about assimilation. And mainline churches are really struggling with assimilation. We're trying to figure that out. And I think not to look at our sisters and brothers who are Pentecostal or charismatic in a negative way, but to try to understand how a mainline church can be more authentic and embrace our identity, but also to adapt. And I think that's what we need to figure out in terms of these unjust relationships that we are currently in.
You know, Michael, I can't help but think about when I was a parish rector, a person came up to me and said, you know, I don't have much use for a church because everyone there are a bunch of hypocrites. And my response to him, yeah, but the good news is there's always room for one more. All of us, whether we are churchgoers or not, we are all hypocrites in one way or another. But there is something about us having to look at the mirror and say, how are we doing? And going back to something you said, Chuck, earlier, from Augustine, talking about the preacher's life, if I remember right from that same section, he quoted at one point saying, "We are your books. We are the books that you will read," saying that to the people. And that's not just true of us here on you all who are the panelists, but for those who are attending, all those who would be, who would claim the name Christian, we are the books that others are reading. And they are going to look at what we're about and what does that mean. So what does it mean today for us to do that? What does it mean to be church in a way that does show forth Jesus in the way you said? Anyone want to take a stab at that?
I'd love to jump in on this more, and I really appreciate that quote. And you know, speaking out of sort of my own strand of Anglican spirituality, the Anglo-Catholic strand, I think when Jesus says this to the Pharisees, he's saying not, I've come to abolish the law, not I've come to abolish all the practices of Judaism, but what's the heart? And if you don't have, if you have only the sacrifices without the mercy, you've missed out on the message of the gospel. And that's, again, speaking, I'm just going to speak to my own strand. That's the danger of our tradition, thinking that that the liturgy, what happens on Sunday morning, is separate from what goes on in the world around the parish, as opposed to seeing that these are the same thing and that we have to go back and forth between the two. And otherwise, we're not providing the sacrifices God desires. And, you know, Chuck's point about Anglican social ethics is grounded deeply in the sacraments is absolutely right. And we can forget that pretty easily if we're only thinking about social action. But if we start thinking that the sacraments just end at the church door and the sacrifice of the Mass on Sunday, we're going directly contrary to what Christ calls us to in the gospel.
You know, we are, in this part of the Anglican Communion, we call ourselves, as do those in Scotland from whom we took the name, the Episcopal Church, Episkopos, bishop. The very name means bishop. Stephen Martin earlier had asked a question. I want to make sure we have a chance to touch on this very briefly, and we want to be real short now as we're getting towards the end. What's the role of our bishops in all this? We can kind of get a sense of what the role of our rectors and vicars and our lay leaders and our congregations. Where do bishops fit in all of this? Who would like to dive into that?
I'm happy to say a few things, although I have no aspirations to be a bishop. It's, you know, I mean, the bishop is a view of the geography and a view of the political situation in the wider area that local clergy just don't have. And so as parishes are looking to do things like reparations, for example, you know, one parish might not have strong relationships with a parish in another part of the diocese who maybe they've done some digging and some history, and they say, you know, our parish has done some harm to this other community. You know, the bishop can you know, do introductory conversations, but the bishop also, I think, can sniff out some of those sins that folks who are really localized can't necessarily see. Sometimes we can get, you know, I spent enough time as a parish priest to know that we can get almost too parochial in our work. And I think, you know, much of the bishop's vocation is to draw, you know, clergy and parishioners out of our own location and to see that wider picture, that wider web.
Thank you for that very much. As we really are getting tight here, I'm so sorry to all those who have been writing questions all along. I wish we had more time. But I do want to take note, Sheila, you wrote the fact that your deanery has formed a committee on racial healing and congregational histories. Well done. I'm delighted to hear that. I hope and believe that many others are doing similar work. You asked if the speakers have any resources to share. If they have a 10-second resource they can share right now, if any one of you wants to say this one, that one. Otherwise, I would ask them to think about that and put it into the things that SEEP will be sending out following this with that. But does anyone have any resources for a group that is looking at racial healing and congregational histories? All right, let's let you think about that and go through your file.
Sorry, I had to unmute. I mean, some of this just quick and dirty, some of the really basic stuff. You know, I mean, looking at, you know, Ibram Kendra's How to Be Anti-Racist, looking at Ta-Nehisi Coates' case for reparations. I mean, I'd love it if there was an essay called the case for Episcopal reparations. You know, like what does that look like, right?
There was a whole movement after in I think 1967. There was precisely, it'd be interesting to revisit. There was exactly that process, and there was actually money paid out in reparations by the Episcopal Church. So there's an interesting history there to be revisited in that process. But yeah, I want to quickly go back to the question about what can we do, and I think this builds on, Elizabeth's point. I do think there's a temptation, particularly for Episcopalians, to take our program off whatever the social movement or ideological gestures of the day are, and then go and kind of perpetuate that in the parish. I think what Elizabeth was talking about was a deep wisdom, the putting people before program and attending to and similar to what Ross was talking about, the concrete histories of how injustice is woven into the fabric of housing, education, in the place you're living, and beginning there. And I think doing the hard work of listening and attending and doing the historical work and then forming the relationships. There is no single program. There's no agenda you can apply. There's no shortcut to relationship building, listening, and attending to the concrete realities of where you live. And unfortunately, the temptation is we want a program, but we have to form a people in a place. And that's always the challenge.
I want to thank also the people who have been in the chat room, not just asking questions, but answering them. I appreciate some of the resources. So please, those who are watching and reading, take a look at some of the resources that have been just listed, some of the answers that have been offered from your fellow attendees. Last question, and I actually want to, forgive me, the person who asked this question, I can't remember whose name it was, I think it was Ken. Forgive me for turning this on its head, but you were asking about what given all that's been said and done, what questions should the Episcopal Church be putting before the presidential candidates? I'd love to have us answer that. I'd love more time to do that. But I'd rather ask each of you right now, what is one thing you want to leave folks with as we are going into a very important and very difficult time, election period, in the midst of COVID, in the midst of racial injustice, and trying to figure out how to work through that. What is one thing you want as a theologian, ethicist, moral theologian? What is one closing thing you want to leave everyone with? And you literally have 20 seconds each. This is lightning round.
Okay, I can start. Can you hear me?
You bet.
Yep.
Go for it, Chuck.
I think that in some deep way, we need to think about the relationship, not just between justice and mercy, but also justice, mercy, and shame. We are in a very shame moment in our culture, and it would be fascinating to have Christians think about the legitimacy of shame and what shame can do to stymie things as well as to enable them. And I think that would be an interesting topic I would like to actually hear sermons on.
Someone else, quick.
I would just say, do not deify the presidency. Try to resist the socialization that this person that's about to be elected president of the United States is somehow divine. Resist that and think about the day after the election of the hard work of trying to do things together. I do think we should vote, definitely, but I'm saying resist the socialization that we all put this godlike person
Yep. You got your 20 seconds. That's great. You are absolutely right. And fighting on what Michael said, episcopalchurch.org. If you go to the Episcopal Church official website and go to the Office of Government Relations, you will find tools to help people get out to vote, tools for how to do that. Again, whatever you're, red, blue, whatever you are, a way to do that. Thank you for that, Michael. Elizabeth, 20
To
seconds.
build on what Michael says, the church isn't dead. We shouldn't, I think we can get so caught up in hopelessness of our time, our political situation, the world. The church isn't dead and Jesus Christ isn't dead. And Jesus Christ's justice is breaking into the world.
Amen. Amen. Who else is left? Luke. 20 seconds.
Let me end with a terrible slogan, but I think builds on what Elizabeth said, which is listen, organize, act, and live as if Jesus really rose from the dead.
Love it. Ross.
Amen to all that. And my thoughts pretty similar to Michael's. The national politics are really important, but your congregation is a political entity, and seek justice there. And I'd say make that your primary means of justice seeking, and still do the other stuff, still vote, do all that. But that's, your congregation is a mini polis.
Thank you. Thank you to you, Elizabeth Rain Kincaid, to you, Michael Battle, to you, Luke Bretherton, to you, Charles Matthews, to you, Ross Kane. What a wonderful group of scholars you have been, and appreciated all of you very much so. And thanks most of all to the SEEP Network, to Anglican Theological Review, and to the Neshoda House for sponsoring this time. And most importantly, we would be talking to each other only if it wasn't for all of you who have been attending. To the 350 folks who registered for this, for all of you attending, thank you. And we wish you a very blessed day, and that wish that you would be a blessing. Remember, you are the book that people are going to read. Take care, and God bless you.